Hello, you are about to listen to another awesome episode of the If I Had One Wish podcast. It's such a pleasure to bring you these meaningful conversations from friends and allies across the Wish network. If you aren't part of the network already, do you know you can join? Either as an individual or a corporate member, you'll get access to all the wonderful things we offer here at Wish and play your part in championing women in our sector. Follow the link in the show notes to find out more, but for now, enjoy the conversation. Well, hello everyone, and welcome to the If I Had One Wish podcast. I am Crystal Hicks, President of Women in Social Housing, and today I am delighted to be joined by Leigh Chambers, who is founder and CEO of Male Allies UK, a business psychologist, UN Women Changemaker of the Year. That was impressive, Leigh, when I read that. And one of the UK's leading voices on male allyship and all things positive masculinity and gender equality. So Leigh works with organisations around the world, helping men become active partners in creating more inclusive workplaces and cultures. So Leigh, welcome to the podcast.
It's a pleasure to be with you, Crystal.
It's really wonderful to have you here. So when I invited you onto the podcast, I said I really would love to talk to you about my See Her campaign and how male allyship could really play a strong role in helping the housing sector see women both in the workplace and within our homes. But before we get into that, I would like our audience to learn a little bit more about you. So spoken openly about your personal journey, including fatherhood, illness, redefining masculinity. Would you help us understand sort of your experiences a bit better and, your journey into male allies?
Yeah, no, thank you, Crystal. Obviously, everyone goes on a journey, and you don't tend to think your journey is particularly interesting. I'm always more curious about what other people's journeys are. And in many ways, that's part of what allyship is about. But I suppose to give a bit of context, if you'd have asked me 15 years ago if I'd been doing this work, the answer from a younger version of me would have been like, I don't think that's really kind of my kind of bag, my kind of thing. But I'm, in my 40s now. I grew up on an estate in Bolton. First one in my family to uni, dropped out, went back, got a grad scheme, got made redundant, and then built a business. And yeah, it was a real journey as a young man who wasn't really sure what he was going to do or what he was going to become. But in many ways, this journey into this work started 12 years ago when I'd built my business, 5 years into it, very successful, suddenly leading people, thought I was a really inclusive leader on reflection. The thought of being an inclusive leader is probably the biggest barrier to being one. But I lost the ability to walk after my immune system failed. And in many ways, that very quickly makes you realise the things you've taken for granted. It makes you realise how pivotal and important health is and how unimportant some other things that you think are really important are. Suddenly, I had to ask for help, to be washed, to help me eat, to move me around anywhere. And as someone who'd prided himself on his independence and his mobility and his physical presence and his ability to get stuff done, it was a really big kind of shift and a big period of reflection to just realise how lucky I was to have a support network and how asking for help was actually very empowering, even though so much of the world tells men that you need to be able to do it yourself. So it was a real reckoning and a chance for me to think who I actually was, with all those considerations around independence and self-sufficiency taken away. I learned to walk again, which again, you fall over a lot. So there's a lot of humility that's built from being picked up off the floor. And a lot of lessons around the fact that you might literally take 2 steps forward one day, but a step backwards the next. But the biggest thing for me was during that period, my daughter was born when I was in walking rehab. It gave me a vision, a mission, a goal. It was to get back on my feet, to take her first steps with her. And I managed to make that. And he highlighted I've had some institutions recognise my work. The most proud moment was actually taking my daughter's first steps with her. But now Crystal, she's 11. I've not beat her much else since. So yeah, for me, that was in many ways the start of my journey 12 years ago. But I decided to take a bit of a different choice in my career. After a year spent recovering, decided to step out and become a stay-at-home dad to my 2 children, not realising that looking after a 3-year-old and a 1-year-old was going to be the most effective leadership and development training course I'd ever been on. And the mental load and reality of looking after toddlers hit me in the face like a brick. I was on my knees some days at 4 p.m. Left the house and realised, oh dear, I forgot something again. And also how broken the UK's caregiving system is.
Yeah.
And the judgment that men get when they stepped out was quite interesting 10 years ago. A little bit better now, but still a lot of work to be done. But to bring it back to, why I set up the very organisation that I run to this day, I needed a bit of respite. I needed a brew. I needed to sit down and speak to some other adults. So I went to my local baby and toddler group, and it was me and 37 mothers and grandmothers. I must admit, it felt a little bit uncomfortable walking into that room, but I was not getting my toddlers out of there without any kind of carnage. So I just went and sat down. And I very quickly realised that every single woman had a story. They were different generations, worked in different industries. They all had something that had happened that I felt was unfair, unjust, or wrong. And it just made me think, what can I actually do? And I took a step back and thought, oh, I need to keep listening. But the truth is, I don't actually know. So that has been the mission, to think how I can close those gender gaps, make a fairer world for women. I did my master's in the evenings. 2 of the modules there were focused on gender. And over the past 10 years, I've worked on health gaps, online misogyny, but an awful lot around workplace cultures, and just got to a point a few years ago where I realised I've benefited so much from this journey in terms of the skills, perspectives, self-awareness. I'm like a different person from going on this journey. But I'm in these rooms of change. There are so few men in these rooms of change. Where are they? What are they doing? So the past few years has been understanding what are men's journeys into this, what stops them, what misconceptions do they hold, what benefits do they get when they do, what motivates them to start, what drives them to keep going. And again, across different industries, finding out what this practically looks like and how we can actually get better gender dialogue between people, more awareness of what individuals are going through, and the difference we can actually make when we fundamentally work together better across that difference.
Yeah, really powerful. Leigh, I know I've heard you sort of share your story a few times in different forums, and yeah, it always strikes me how resilient you've had to be, but also how once you've got that understanding of actually something that needs to change, that you've really been able to sort of take that and build something really impactful. Probably in amongst that, I imagine you've been asked questions around like, well, what does male allyship look like? And is it just about being like men being supportive of women? And, I always have that vision of, like the suffragettes when they went out with like their banners on and like their marches. What were their husbands doing when they're at home making the tea, like being supportive? But, there's that perception sometimes that allyship is just, oh, well, you go out and do that thing, love, and I'll look after the kids for an hour. But it's not just support, is it? It's different. So yeah, I'm just keen to understand, like, how do you describe that to people when they say, well, what is male allyship? How does it look different to just sort of being supportive of women and what they're doing?
Yeah, so I think allyship in many ways has a little bit of a image issue. There's lots of misconceptions. So what we see for allyship is fundamentally is not an ideology. So it's not you believe something or you don't. And it's not an identity. You are an ally or you're not. Allyship is a fundamental set of skills that help you and support you to work across difference. And that can look different in how you apply those skills. So sometimes it will be stepping forward and intervening when behaviour is inappropriate and having some of those challenging conversations with people that need to be had. But sometimes it'll be stepping to the side, garnering feedback from perspectives that are different than yours. Sometimes it'll be mentoring or sponsoring. And it's that partnership aspect that, again, is part of that skill set, but is less on the front foot and more in collaboration. Sometimes allyship is actually stepping back, yielding the space to voices that aren't always heard, providing resources to things that you're not at the front and spearhead of, but are driving change. Sometimes it's actively about removing yourself from a situation and letting someone else be seen, heard, and valued. And what's really important is that allyship, that positioning, can be different in different circumstances. But the skills of understanding how to position yourself, the skills of being able to understand when to call out or call in or call forward behaviours, the ability to think and take a moment to consider who's not had a voice in this room, who's not in the spaces where decisions are made, who is doing that glue work, but the things that don't get you promoted, but keep the whole operation going, who's not getting credited on the projects they've clearly been a part of, and who's having their ideas stolen and credit being taken by someone else, who's constantly being interrupted because the voice isn't being heard and they're not being listened to, and how can we bring them back in? So allyship is in many ways a set of skills and the application of those skills to make fairer, more inclusive, and fundamentally safer workplaces where everyone can perform, everyone can bring their best self, and everyone can reach their potential. And obviously, allyship sometimes is things we do for ourselves, where we take a step outside of our own algorithm and our own network to actually reflect on what other people's lived experiences are like. Sometimes it's how we interact with others, the team around us, clients, stakeholders, people who reside, our service users, and understanding how our interactions with them can actually make their lives fundamentally better, make them feel included and heard, but also how they can be potentially feel excluded, and understanding how our interactions impact our everyday. And finally, around the systems, because we all live in systems and have access to some level of ability to change systems. So whether that is who gets access to certain people or certain levers of change, whether it's how meetings are run, how networking is allocated, how projects are decided, how promotion processes are run, how recruitment is structured, all those different levers, if you reduce resistance and friction in those systems, that allows people to be able to get to where they get to and allows the opportunity for those systems to become fairer so everyone can come together and work together more effectively. So that's how I define allyship. And it's a lot wider because people generally default to one group helping another, when
Yes.
actually allyship is a universal skill set. And the biggest thing we find from the men that we work with is when they build these skills and try and apply them, they also open themselves up to be allied to as well. Given men are going through a whole range of challenges and are not always the best at asking for support, that's one of the most powerful things we've seen from this work.
Yeah. Wow. That's incredible, Leigh. And I think what really has stuck in my mind from the way you described all of that is that it's a skill set. And the thing I love about that is skill sets can be learned. So I often hear from men in a jokey way where they'll say, "Oh, it's just not for me, this allyship thing, Crystal. Like, it's not, like I support the work you're doing, love, but like I don't think, I could be a male ally as such. It's just not the sort of part of the way I am." But actually, if it's a skill set, anybody can learn any skill set if they've got the desire to do so. So yeah, I think it's really helpful to talk about allyship in the terms of just developing those skills and that mutually beneficial thing. It's not all about being the benefactor or the benefactee, but actually just everybody getting something from it. I love that. So my See Her campaign, I think, has allyship running through its very veins, Leigh. It's about trying to get the social housing sector to, I suppose, make better decisions for women that work in our organisations, women that live in our homes. We are becoming a data and information obsessed sector. Maybe, decades of not really having our eye on the data. We've definitely gone in heavy on the value of data and decision making, but the data is so often not there around women's experiences of the workplace, women's health, women's experiences of the world. And so this was the data that you would need in the workplace to be able to make good decisions for your female staff or to make good decisions for your female tenants and customers. Is just often such a gap. And organisations will often therefore lean on perception and bias in decision making, and sometimes like the good intention but the wrong decision therefore as a result. So you work a lot in workplaces with organisations. Just really keen to understand, like, do you think there's a bit of a perception gap, a bit of a bias around how men and women experience the workplace. I wonder if you could speak a little to that.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's so much to be said, Crystal, and it's one of the reasons why your campaign is so important. I mean, what we found is one of the first pieces of research I came across when I started this journey 10 years ago was the Work With Me research that was carried out in America and Canada. And
Mm-hmm.
what that showed is they interviewed men and women to find out what the gap between women's lived reality and men's perception of women's reality was. And it was fascinating because 81% of women felt some form of exclusion at work, but 91% of men didn't think they were excluding women. And that massive gap in perception versus reality is in many ways the lived experience gap we still see in workplaces today, where women, the centering of women's stories hasn't been done from a historical context. You can walk along the street and almost all the statues are men. There's more statues of animals than statues of women who lived and changed the world. All the streets are named after men. The history textbooks omitted a lot of women to ensure there was lots of space for men. And workplaces were built in a way that still to this day, we think about much of the terminology that we use was co-opted from the military at a time when women were not allowed to enroll in the military either. And we still use company and firm and battlefield and chains of command and hierarchies and strategies and all the things that that terminology has been taken from a very combative, very competitive, and very one-dimensional world that's still deeply woven into the business landscapes that we work within. And that's before we look at the massive advances that women have made over the past 50 years in many, many areas of society. But that means still many aspects of the workplace are still relatively male by default. And it's not necessarily male by default, it's a certain type of male by default, meaning there are lots of men who also become a bit more agentic in their traits to try and fit in on that leadership journey. And some of those traits that are fundamentally a little bit more collaborative and a little bit more kind of group orientated get lost on that journey. But the reason why the campaign is so important is because still what we hear this very day is that many of the women we speak to don't have the levels of visibility that they feel they should have for the work that they do, for the potential that they have, and for the things that they've achieved, especially as they become a bit more senior. And also the gendered ageism lens that makes them feel more invisible that doesn't impact men in the same way. They're still more likely to be questioned on the competency. They're still less likely to be promoted on the potential that will she do it again? And some of the things we still hear are massively problematic. And obviously a big part of that is men challenging that system, because men do still carry more institutional power in many places because of how the world is structured. And even for industries with a lot of female talent coming in, where the pipeline is massive, so to speak, we still see at the very top of that industry, there's lots of chaps who are sometimes a little bit more aware of this and sometimes maybe not so much. And we've just interviewed 27 male CEOs and chairs to understand their perspectives on gender balance. And that in itself was really interesting. From the interviews we do with women, the interviews we do with men, looking at the gender gaps that exist, those gender gaps are pretty stubborn and still exist in a lot of places. And a big part of those gaps are systems. A little part of those gaps are individual and everyone can take some accountability for them. But the reality is that we still see that in most organizations, women are less likely to be visible and seen, less likely to be heard and listened to, and less likely to be valued and cherished. And some of that is baked into just the way that we become biased by the very world around us that does put men up on a bit of a pedestal and puts them at the forefront. And there's a subconscious aspect to that. It's also a conscious choice to decide whether you're going to be happy to just let the status quo be, or you're actually willing to be suspicious around why the status quo is like it is and start to challenge it.
Yeah, yeah. I, I think there is that sort of perception gap that you talked about, in terms of the 82% in terms of in the workplace. And I think we recognize that it's there. How do you change it? Because I think putting the data out there, the statistics out there, it can be impactful. So I think, the gender pay gap reporting has done quite a good job in highlighting statistically that women aren't getting paid the same as men for the same work. But it's not shifting the dial enough. It's like, oh, well, that's a shame, but there's nuance behind it and we'll do our best to get better. But when I think about your story, what hits me is that the thing that was the catalyst for you was to go into that toddler group and listening to the stories of women, listening to their lived experience. And I think the journey that I've been on with my campaign, it's really made me realize that actually, yes, getting better data and information to help us make decisions is going to be really important. But equally, if not more so important, is storytelling and people sharing what their experiences actually are. And when I speak to a lot of men who have become allies, when I say to them, what was the catalyst to you becoming an ally? And they're like, I had a daughter. And all of a sudden that became real for me. And, she would talk to me about things and I'd be like, wow, and it's those stories, isn't it, that we hear that help us understand. And from the understanding, isn't it, that we can be active participants in change. So yeah, just how have you seen storytelling and the impact and create change in this space? Do you think it's as important as I'm making it out to be?
Yeah, I think there's three things, Crystal. I think, firstly, data is good if it's good data.
Mm-hmm.
So there are a range of studies in the diversity space and the gender space that, if I'm brutally honest, are not worth the PDF they've been created on, because it's not robust. And some of the statistics from those get thrown around. It's not helpful. Most people don't really care about a consultant's business case for this. It's not personal and relevant to them.
Mm.
But in the world that we're in today, we do need, current robust data to understand where we're starting and how we move forward. Those lived experience gaps, if we don't know how big the gap is, how can we support people to work on closing those gaps? And most people don't actually like the idea that women are experiencing the world in a worse way, because it fundamentally makes them feel like, wow, that's, again, women that I know, women that are close to me, women that I care about, women that I work with are suffering something that I'd not really thought about, because lots of these things were just default to me and I didn't realise they had to change the behaviour 27 times a day just to be able to continue to do what they do and still probably outperform half the people. So data's important because you need to know the gaps that we're closing. If we don't know the gaps that we're closing, it ends up being quite performative and guesswork, which then, if things don't change, creates that, well, we tried, which isn't helpful for everyone. The storytelling is really important because much of this work kind of starts people's motivations when we kind of do understand that in our research. Almost everyone starts this journey because they want to make a difference for other people. When we kind of look at those primary motivations, it is an emotive bridge to someone else's experience. They realise how I felt when I got excluded, but that's actually happening to my colleagues day after day after day. I don't want them to feel like that. Or my partner or my daughter or someone I really care about has kind of shone a light on some of my own blind spots. And suddenly now I can't unsee it and I want to make a change. And it's really important that, firstly, that's quite often a pathway in. But interestingly, that doesn't always tend to lead to sustained action, because it will get uncomfortable when you start to learn new skills, because most of us are beginners in many of these skills. And that discomfort means that people, if it doesn't also tie into your own story, might not sustain and continue to embed those skills in the future. So part of our work is actually also work with men to understand, what are your drivers within this? What are the benefits that you might get from it? Because very few men actually know, because they start to try and make it different for other people. They don't realise it'll become different for them. And it's really important we highlight those stories, including the stories of the men who are like, actually, the benefits from this is I can now deal with those really volatile tenants or that really frustrating contractor. Suddenly, they're doing what I want them to do. Wow, it's a proper great thing to have in my toolbox, this. I think obviously the final point to that, Crystal, is, again, that reflection around, good data, stories that connect and that are relevant. But possibly the biggest thing in this work at times is about relevancy.
Mm.
Obviously, a lot of inclusion work is quite general. If in my working environment, this doesn't feel tangibly something that is relevant to me, the point in my career that I'm at, with the nature of the work that I do in the environments that I work within, it feels optional. It feels like it's not designed with me in mind. It feels like it's not really that relevant. So you've got to have the data, you've got to have the stories and understanding of individual motivation as well as collective motivation, but you also need relevancy. It needs to be something that I can practically do, because there's an awful lot of theory, and it doesn't always come down to people's everyday practical realities, especially strategies that are designed by people who don't tend to work in environments where there's a shift in nature or lots of travel involved in closed spaces or lots of interaction
Mm.
with the built environment.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that relevancy point is so important, isn't it? And I think we see the relevance shifting. It's like shifting sands sometimes in terms of like the external environment around equality and inclusion and equity. And yeah, I think it can be a really difficult place or a really difficult thing for workplaces to navigate through, because those sands seem to just shift so much around this, and there's so many priorities, isn't it? It's that, well, what's relevant to you and your organization at this time, and not just tick boxing, but actually where can you have the biggest impact, and what would this look like for you, and being really sort of almost inward focused in that sense, as opposed to sort of, they seem to do that good thing over there, so we'll just duplicate that, or yeah. So I think that relevancy is so important. You've spoke about your daughter. I have twin girls as well, and as they get older and I get older, so much of my life is now focused around how do I make the world a better place for them, as opposed to improve it for me. How can I do my bit to make sure that when they get to my age and they have their children, that they're living in a more hopeful, joyful, equitable, inclusive world in which they can thrive. So how do we sort of help young girls see that they can become the leaders of tomorrow? What do they need? What do we need to be showing in here and now to encourage them to feel that that's an option for them?
Yeah, I think it's a really important consideration. And firstly, there's a place that, for example, for your daughters, they see you know, leading a whole kind of entity that's making a massive social impact in the world. And they are starting to see women in representation in so many fields. The growth of sports, more women in politics, more women in their everyday lives. And I think we need to hold on to that and really remember just how far we've come, but also appreciate that there's still a significant dream gap for many young girls to actually get to where they would want to, because there are still so many barriers that exist. And I think holding those two truths is really important. When we've done kind of research with younger people, what we are still finding is that girls are navigating an increasingly challenging world with technology that is kind of shaping jobs that they're going to be doing in the future, that is continually bombarding them with a certain way of being,
Hmm.
making them feel sometimes like they're not as kind of whole and able to explore as they can. And obviously, there's a massive thing that where 2/3 of young girls and young women modify their everyday behaviour to be safe.
Hmm.
And that's not women who work in volatile environments, that's women across the UK. And we've got to really think about, if you are continually modifying your everyday routine to be safe, and all the cognitive capacity to make those adaptations, those adjustments, then you don't have the same amount of capacity to be able to really execute on the things that you want. That's also taking into account that women do 62% of the unpaid labour in in this
Mm.
country, and all the additional mental load that I felt when all of a sudden I was a primary caregiver.
Hmm.
So there's those real considerations, and I think it's really important that we just kind of get more perspective on each other's lived experience. We've been doing stuff to get boys and girls in a room and just hear the lives and share those perspectives, because the algorithm keeps us away from each other.
Absolutely.
And the world is creating active kind of gender division and then seeding perspectives. Basically, there's lots of men telling boys what girls want. Like, stuff like that is really unhelpful because men don't know what girls want. But if boys go and talk to girls, girls will probably give them a good idea of what they think is a good thing. And our research with boys as well is to understand what their lives are like, some of the challenges that they're facing. I suppose the final point, Crystal, is we were part of a project with a number of different organisations to understand for young women taking their first step into management. What's clear is for a lot of people coming into the workforce now, it's quite equal, men and women. But even in that first step into management, 10% more men go up than women do. Why? And we kind of asked women, what made the floor feel a little bit sticky? And there was numerous different things to come from it. There was conversations around kind of confidence and network, especially from women from lower socioeconomic backgrounds. Just the education system felt a bit fairer because everyone was taking the same tests. But you go into the workplace and the rules are just not fair. There's barriers for women as soon as they start the career. And that kind of knocked and nudged my confidence a little bit. And they didn't see the representation in the same way that they had in the prior educational system that they'd been within. And sometimes it was just understanding how those worlds work a little bit. And that's why obviously mentorship and sponsorship and networks are really powerful. But also, you need to look at those barriers.
Yeah.
There's those barriers that are keeping even young women kind of, they're spending so much energy dodging barriers, scaling barriers, digging underneath them, that they just then end up with just less capacity to be able to go and do the things that sadly get you promoted in a world where they're quite often looking at one set of figures and not even people's leadership ability. So
No. Yeah. I think that thing around when you spoke about getting boys and girls in a room to talk to one another and actually boys hearing it from girls as opposed to boys hearing it from men. And it really made me think about my daughters, because my daughters are twins, Leigh, twin girls, but non-identical and very different. So Alice does cheerleading and, loves Taylor Swift, and, you can picture her, she's into lip gloss. And Rosie's always loved football, won't wear a dress. Rosie's best friends have always been boys. And, she spends a lot of her time with boys. And I've asked them separately, describe the boys in your class. And Alice, who doesn't spend as much time with the boys, she does spend some time with them, but not much, will say things like, "Oh, they're silly. They're stupid. They're always getting into trouble. They say daft things. You can't take them seriously. I'm always telling them off." She's a teller offer. And then Rosie, when I asked her, she'll say, "Oh, they make me laugh. They're really kind. They're into really cool stuff." And it's just interesting that because Rosie spent more time with the boys, she and they're only young, they're in primary school, but she has a much better understanding of actually, they're both observing the same behaviors, but understanding it in different ways because of the fact that one of them knows the boys very well and the other one doesn't. And I that's always like, I've done a lot of work in equity and inclusion over the years, and that's probably been the most sort of transformational in my thinking about how do we actually solve these problems. It's about spending time with people who aren't like us and understanding them better from their perspectives instead of taking that second or third hand from somebody else.
yeah, assumptions sit at the heart of this. The more we get to know people around us, the less assumptions we make. And even good attentioned assumptions into big gaps are quite often wrong. So the power of just kind of getting to know people, getting curious, getting outside of our algorithm, getting outside of what we know, it is a little bit scary. But actually, our curious 7-year-old within us will thank us the more we do it.
Yeah, absolutely. Which leads us nicely, Leigh, onto my final question, which is the question that we ask all of our guests on the podcast, which is, if you had one wish, and you're only allowed one, you had one wish for the housing sector, what would it be and why?
So if the housing sector can build places for people to come together, then the housing sector can also build cultures of housing organisations where people can truly come together and everyone can be seen, heard and valued.
Amazing. Amen to that. Well, that's the end of today's podcast. Thank you so much, Leigh. I think you and I could talk for hours about how we solve this and make the world a better place, but we've run out of time. So thanks for coming on. Thank you for everybody who's tuned in. If you've liked what you've heard today, this episode is part of our Here Come the Boys series, which is all focused around male allyship and the role of men in the See Her campaign and making the world a more equitable and inclusive place for everybody. So until next time, thank you. Thank you everyone for listening to the If I Had One Wish podcast. Next time, we'll be talking to another inspirational female from the housing sector who will be sharing her career story and what she's learned along the way. And of course, we'll be asking again the big question. If she had one wish, what would it be and why? See you next time.